Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Liberty Hangout podcast. My name is Justin, and I'm the founder of libertyhangout.org, and I'm joined tonight by my co-host and co-founder of the site, James Chalemi. Tonight, we are joined by a man with too many accomplishments for me to list, so I will name some of his most recent ones to start off. He is the CLO of the website liberty.me. He's a distinguished fellow of the Foundation for Economic Education. He's an executive editor of Laissez Faire Books. He's a research fellow at the Acton Institute, and he is the founder of the CrytoCurrency Conference. Needing no further introduction, I introduce to you the man best known for his bow ties, Jeffrey Tucker. Thank you so much for joining us, Jeffrey. How are you this evening?
Fine, and thanks for starting the site. I think it's really entrepreneurial and awesome that you're doing this.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Well, I mean, it's a labor of love, right? I'm sure you're not making the big bucks, but it's very cool. It's a testament to your own belief in liberty and your understanding that it's the force that drives the world forward. So congratulations to you.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. Now, can you tell us and our followers a little bit more about the origins of your political beliefs and what your history is with the Mises Institute?
Let's see. Well, you know, my parents were Goldwater Republicans, really. And which I think, you know, what's interesting as I look back at it, you know, they never preached politics to me, but I think we tend to absorb a certain political ethos from our parents, you know? I don't know if you recall that, but I remember being in, I don't know, like third grade, and the public school had these things called the Weekly Reader. And, you know, you can imagine a public school newspaper, you know, had a strong bias. So, and Watergate was going on, can you imagine? And I just had some sense that Nixon was getting a bum rap, you know, that there were sort of bad guys out there that were sort of hectoring him for no apparent reason. And being the only guy in my class to sort of stand up for Richard Nixon, even though I had no basis for doing so, you know, it's something I observed from my mom and dad. And so I think that was generally my political bias. And then in high school, I bumped into a couple of nonfiction works by Ayn Rand, and that made me feel smart. Do you know that feeling when you first read Rand? You know, especially at that age. You know, like,
that's how I felt when I first came across your YouTube videos.
That's sweet, but I felt like I have a philosophy, and everybody else is kind of shabby in this crazy school of mine. So I would go out on dates, you know, with girls and ruin them by talking about the, you know, ethical egoism and that sort of thing. And they're like, oh, really?
I know that feeling.
Interesting. You're so smart and fascinating. You know, so that was, and then I think I forgot about it for a few years until, there comes a point in your life when ideas start to suddenly matter to you. And that was my junior year in college when I finally, because before I had been working like 2 jobs. You know, I was managing a men's store and like playing gigs on the weekends in a jazz band and all. You know, I was very, very busy. And then once I was able to get my school funded, because this nice MacArthur Academy program decided to pay for everything. Then I started living in a library, and I started really caring about ideas. And that was about the time the first Reagan administration, and I became kind of a big partisan of you know, conservatism as it was then constituted. And, you know, that failed me, right? I mean, because at some point I realized that these people are inconsistent, that they were all about just supporting a single political party, and there were things that didn't make sense, really, within that framework. So I began to kind of read a lot in the conservative libertarian debate, and I couldn't quite make sense of it. I didn't know where I stood, really, until I bumped into, well, I kind of left that aside, and I got interested in economics, really. And
Now, can I ask you who you were reading at the time?
Well, at the time I was reading a lot of Cold War history because I was fairly interested in, like, Whittaker Chambers and some of that early debates. Stan Evans, I was interested in him. And I was reading a lot of publication that comes out from Institute for Intercollegiate Studies Institute called Modern Age. And Buckley, I got fascinated with Buckley as a kind of a figure. But and then I read a book by Hans Sennholz when I was an economics major, and that drew me into the Austrian tradition. From there I found Mises, and Mises became sort of my guy. You know, I began to just, so this was before the internet. I went to Washington, D.C. for a journalism program where I was working at the Senate Press Gallery, and I was walking along the road, and the Mises Institute had offices there at the time. And there was a sign up that said the Mises Institute, and I thought, oh my God, the unity of radicalism and science, what could be better? And I just walked in and said, I just want to volunteer.
Wow.
And that was it. I met Lou Rockwell at that point, and there were like 3 people working there maybe, and nobody had ever heard of it. And I just thought it was a wonderful cause, and I just threw myself into it. Ended up working there for a very long time and building their website and starting the Mises University and really sort of kicking that whole thing off in a big way. And it was awesome for me. When the internet came along, my life changed, of course, because that's when I thought I realized that I could distribute to the multitudes, really, all the works that I love so much, and didn't have to rely on libraries and gatekeepers. And that was awesome. And I fell in love with digital technology just as a tool of communication. Wow. And so that's what I devoted myself to, and that's what I'm still doing. I mean, it's funny. You look back at it, and it's like, what's my key value added in this world? You always have to ask that question. And for me, building digital properties that distribute freedom-oriented literature it's my passion. I never lose it, and I'm in love with it, and I'm doing it all over again now. I started at the Foundation for Economic Education consulting about 1.5 years ago, and I've been working full-time not even quite a year. And I'm building the site up again, and we're iterating on a daily basis, and it's my true love. And I tell you what, it's a very awesome thing to be able to get paid for the thing you love the most, and that's what I'm doing right now.
I think that's a mildly similar story to what James and I have, who came from conservative backgrounds as well, and were able to work out our inconsistencies. And then, like you, we went on to develop a passion for spreading the message of liberty, and that's how we created Liberty Hangout.
Well, it's for me, what fell from conservative, like, how did I get away from conservatism? It was the warmongering stuff. That's
right.
For me. I mean, like in 1984, I was like, oh, bomb the Soviets. By 1986, I tended to think of the U.S. as a terror state. So I went through a gigantic intellectual shift on matters of foreign policy. And I think that's what finally just embedded me into libertarianism.
Right. I think for me, it was the fiscal conservatism of the foreign policy of the United States, or the lack thereof, that really led me away from the war movement as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I remember I had a friend of mine when I was in college. His name was Joe Branham. And it was this like 1984, I guess. And I said, well, I think we really should invade Nicaragua. And he said, well, yeah, I agree with that. But, the problem, because he was a Marine, he was an ex-Marine, he said the problem with war is really strange. He said it really comes down to fungus. And I said, what are you talking about, fungus? He said, well, it's awful. When you're in the military, they don't really issue good socks. You have to wear the same socks over and over again, the same shoes. And especially in Nicaragua, you're going to be in all sorts of muddy waters all the time. And then you're going to get athlete's foot. It spreads to your ankles and spreads to your legs, and then you jock itch, and they don't ever have any medicines. And then you have to go to bed at night with the fungus crawling all over your body. I was like, okay. Can we rethink this whole invasion of Nicaragua thing? It shocks me to hear, because that sounds like a nightmare, right? I mean, and it's kind of a dumb thing. It's not as significant as millions dead, but it penetrated my brain. I thought, yeah, war doesn't sound so hot after all. In light of that, it's funny how little things that people say kind of can spark, an intellectual change. That wasn't a substantial point, but it really made an impression on me that war is very personal for people. I hadn't really thought of it that way before. I had thought of war as being some, great Nietzschean, episodic historical upheaval that we needed from time to time, Well, once you think of it in terms of war as being just, fungus for the soldiers and suffering for the orphans on the other side, it begins to change your outlook a lot.
Yeah, Machiavelli and Nietzsche don't really go into that too much, do they?
No, they don't.
I think I'm definitely in accordance with you there, Jeffrey. Once you realize it's not just about countries, but also about individuals losing life, I think it really changes your perspective on things.
Mm-hmm.
Now, just moving on a bit, when I first became a voluntarist, my friend recommended that I watch some of your videos on YouTube. And so hearing you talk about Bitcoin was really my first experience learning about it. And I think that a number of people have heard of Bitcoin and know that it's a digital currency, but that's the real extent of their knowledge of it. Can you explain to our listeners how Bitcoin works, how it holds its value, and why cryptocurrencies are preferential to fiat currency?
Yeah, well, the reason they're preferential is that they exist outside of government and outside of banks and central banks, and that's just, an awesome thing. I mean, they really are peer-to-peer technology, so that anyone with a digital device can become an owner of this property and port this information in an immutable way to any other person in the world almost instantly at virtually zero price. I mean, that's an incredible thing. Now, I was a skeptic of Bitcoin for a very long time because I was convinced that you can't create a currency, using computer code. It had to emerge out of a real commoditized barter system, like Mises said. And so it took me a long time, even after I started writing about Bitcoin, to understand why it was a valuable tool. And it took me about a year to crack the code and figure out why this thing was valuable. And what's valuable about it is the blockchain, actually. It's that ability to port immutable information on a non-contiguous over non-contiguous geographic regions that makes it so awesome. We've never been allowed to do that in history. Take a perfect piece of titled property and hurl it, anywhere into space, and have it land in somebody else's possession. That's never been possible, and so the blockchain makes that possible. So Bitcoin's value is derived from this awesome service, essentially, of being able to port, scarce property. It's scarce in the sense that it's scarce by the computer code scarce. It's not scarce in a physical sense, but the computer code makes it scarce. And so that becomes the source of its value. So, Bitcoin has all the properties of money, like its divisibility and its portability and its scarcity, but it's better than gold and silver because it can be ported at virtually zero cost anywhere in the world. You can't do that with gold and silver. So it takes up it weighs nothing, and it takes no space. And that's kind of awesome because that means you don't have to have an institution that warehouses it, for example. Whereas with gold and silver, you always had to have warehousing institutions. That gives rise to banks and then central banks and all the disaster. So Bitcoin is an amazing innovation. I mean, 10 years ago, nobody would have thought something like this were possible. And now it's all around us.
Right. Now you mentioned that it's preferential to fiat because fiat obviously has government involved. But in addition to this, as we presently have our fiat currency, it's an inflationary currency. Can you explain the difference there with Bitcoin, which is a deflationary currency?
Yeah, it's deflationary in the sense that, I should say that Bitcoin does increase in its quantity on a regular basis, but there's no policy associated with it. It's an algorithm. So there's something like, 25 new Bitcoins released every 10 minutes, something like that. But there's an upper limit on it, and we'll bump into that after we're all gone from this world. But it's more Hayekian in the sense that it's rule-based instead of just being at the discretion of central bankers. Over the last 6 years, the Federal Reserve has created $4 trillion in new currency. I mean, you can't do that with Bitcoin. So it's more like the gold standard in that sense. And I just love the idea of Hayek dreamed of a currency that would live outside of government. He said for 6,000 years we've had currencies more or less monopolized by the state. Wouldn't it be awesome if we had a currency that were entirely private? Well, now we've actually seen that happen. And that's an amazing moment in history for liberty.
And I know Bitcoin is one of the most contended discussion groups in libertarian circles, and I know there seems to be a divide, especially among our viewers and our followers, anarcho-capitalists alike, between the wonks and the pragmatists. Now, Jeff Deist, who you well know, lays out 4 ways in which we can work towards a free society. Now, the first, he says, is engaging in the political process. The second, agorism. The third, winning the hearts and minds. And the fourth is physical revolution. What do you see as the proper course for libertarians to take in order to reach free society?
Well, I don't mind any of these things. As a physical revolution, I think it's just highly dangerous and really a distraction. Politics can sometimes be a distraction, though if people like it, there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's fine. I just think people get exaggerated attachments to politics. They have inflated expectations for what it can do for us, and then they're inevitably disappointed. I mean, the last politicians I worked for was Reagan in 1984, and I just lost all interest after that. In fact, even from 1984, which is a long time, up until this year, I haven't really been interested in politics. I suddenly got interested in politics, mainly in opposition to it all, but I've been watching the debates and keeping up with everything and talking about it as a kind of a tool for helping people learn and that sort of thing. Agorism, I think, is a wonderful strategy. What was the fourth one?
Winning the hearts and minds, kind of like what we're doing here.
Education, yeah, education. Yeah, I think my preference is for agorist sort of entrepreneurial efforts. I like them, especially since now we have the tools to do it, whereas we didn't have them in the past. And then also, I think education is just absolutely essential. You have to have a public that is at least convinced that liberalism is a good idea. If you're in a world where liberalism is hated and despised and people don't understand what laissez-faire means, and they fear freedom, then it's not likely to be able to keep it. So I think both those things are really important. Yeah, as far as revolution goes, I think it's just highly dangerous. I mean, I like, as you said, physical revolution. And I understand why people are attracted to it. The problem is it doesn't usually work. I mean, in fact, I don't know that it's ever really worked. What happens is that it ends up actually doing the opposite of what you want. Cop killing is a disaster. I mean, favoring real revolution. I mean, if we win, we'll never win. And if we do win, what happens is you just end up creating a new elite, sort of like the American Revolution did. And that was the best revolution in history, and even that sort of went wrong. So.
Now, if you can imagine one of your good friends, Christopher Cantwell, when I asked him that question, his response was physical revolution.
Yeah. And I think his point is simply that it's not unjust, that these are the aggressors, so it's okay to defend yourself against aggression. That all sounds fine in the abstract, but I don't know. I think it's highly dangerous, and it's just ineffective, really. So I just can't go there. I'm not prepared to say it is. I'm not every. I guess another way to put it is that not everything that's just is recommended. And if you know for certain from studying of history that kind of approach actually ends up hurting the prospects for liberty, then you have a responsibility to study history and understand it in light of that.
Right.
Great point.
Now, I recently read Chase Rachel's book titled A Spontaneous Order, The Capitalist Case for a Stateless Society, and throughout he keeps driving home how we need property rights in order to maximize our utility. Now, for people that aren't too knowledgeable about our philosophy, the first thing that they will ask in response to this is, but who will enforce these property rights? Who will punish the violators? And I know from reading your works that you contend that capitalism is not a system that comes from enforcement, but is rather a phenomenon that occurs when people freely associate with one another. Can you explain how this phenomenon occurs and how it fits perfectly with the private property rights?
Yeah. Okay, this is a very serious subject and something that's really very important for us to kind of address and understand. If you read the history of property rights literature, like John Locke, for example, what you find is a kind of a presumption that there is an enforcement agency out there, to allocate it and to say, oh, well, you have mixture labor with this, therefore you can own it. There's a presumption of a kind of an exogenous judge out there that decides whether your property is legitimate, and then if it decides it is, then it's going to enforce it for you. And I think this is an ahistorical perspective, essentially. That's not where property rights come from. And if you look at much better treatment, actually, of this whole subject appears in the book by Socialism, called Socialism by Mises in 1922. And he describes a different origin of property than you get in John Locke. And essentially, and anthropologists have confirmed this too, property comes about because for reasons of social utility. It's a technology that's invented to overcome the problems of scarcity. So let's just imagine, for example, in history, there was a time, and everybody says that this is probably true. All the anthropologists talk like this, that there might have been a period in history, maybe 150,000 years ago, where there was enough plenty so that you didn't need property rights. Maybe you needed your cave, you needed your clothes, But in terms of food, which is the great struggle that we all face day to day, there was enough to go around. There were enough slow-moving animals. There's enough things growing. There's enough to feed you day to day, and there's no particular reason to establish property rights so long as you can get what you want without them. But the problem comes about when suddenly scarcity presents itself, and there's a tragedy of the commons. Everything's been over. People have been eating too much and just gathering too much, and there's not enough killing too much. There's not enough animals to go around, and so somebody has to come up with the idea of domesticating animals and agriculture. And that necessarily requires like creating fences to keep the animals in, to breed them, and necessarily requires that you have a plot of land that you call your own, so you can cultivate it for purpose of agriculture. And the question is, and this is what's interesting here, how is that enforced? Once that decision comes about, and maybe as an entrepreneur, it's like, I'm going to raise goats. Nobody touch my frickin' goats, all right? And people are like, well, to hell with you. I mean, why should those be your goats and not mine too? So the goat owner has to come up with an incentive for other people to respect what he's calling his property rights. So he might suggest, look, I tell you what, you've got some beans being raised outside of your cave there. I kind of need those beans. I'll leave your beans alone if you leave my goats alone. And then once I have enough goat milk and you have enough beans, then we can trade and exchange, and we'll both be better off. So they develop a commercial relationship with each other, and a localized social norm that says, I'm going to respect yours and you're going to respect mine. Do you see what I mean? I mean, so it's a very interesting kind of. Now, what if they're not respected? What if somebody who's trying to get your goats and doesn't have beans to offer, and they're just jerks and they just want to pillage you? There's no authority to go to and say, hey, this is a bad guy. Put him in jail. So I'm going to sue him, whatever. What you have to do ultimately is come up with some kind of technology to defend your goats against invasion. You have to find a way to protect your own property. And that requires certain defense tools, maybe hire fences, maybe hiring somebody to beat the person if they try to come across your property, whatever. But essentially, I think that this is a very interesting analysis to me, because it suggests that the limits of what you can and cannot own are not determined by some exogenous rule, like a Ten Commandments coming down, or Locke's great adjudicator, or whatever. Ultimately, what is and isn't property is determined by what you are technologically able to defend, and that's it. In presenting what I just said to you, I'm giving you a slightly elaborated version of what Mises says in his book Socialism. That ultimately it's your own ability to enforce your property rights that determine your property rights. And I think there's something to that. I really do. In fact, I think it's my preferred understanding of where private property comes from. And even today, you can see that, well, we're talking about 150,000 years ago, but really, the property rights universally understood didn't become a kind of social consensus until the late Middle Ages. I mean, if you were a peasant living in, say, the 13th century Europe, you might have been able to cobble together a nice situation where you're just now leaving the feudal lord plantation. You've got a little homestead, and you live near other people. Your property rights are probably secure in that one area, but one thing you never wanted to do was travel, because the instant you left your small community and went on the road, then all bets are off. I mean, you can claim you own the clothes on your back and the gold in your purse, but if nobody's respecting that, in what sense is that true? I mean, you're going to be pillaged and robbed. I mean, the word travel is funny because its origins trace through a French term that date back to the Latin term meaning a danger. It's just dangerous to friggin' travel. It was a terrible thing. You always had to go in groups. If you ever went alone, you damn sure better have weaponry with you. It was very rare for people to ever travel by themselves. And if you did, you had to be pretty much rich, so you could call on other people and use weaponry and that sort of thing. This fascinating thing about the whole story of the Good Samaritan, for example. It's almost certain that the Good Samaritan was a merchant, because otherwise he would not have been traveling by himself. I mean, the kings, would travel. You would otherwise travel in packs to present. But this guy was apparently traveling by himself. Like, why would you do that? And probably he had enough. He had the means to be able to defend himself against invasion, whereas the guy he helped, clearly did not. And sure enough, he was probably a merchant because he had developed relationships with local hotels where he was able to put the guy and actually put the guy in there on credit and everything else like that. But anyway, so my point is that a social consensus for property rights doesn't come about until very, very late. And even now, right, there's an inconsistent appreciation of property that's out there. Like, let's say that I take my car to a downtown bar, and I park on the street, and I think, I don't need my wallet in this bar. These people know me, so I'm going to leave it on the trunk of my car. And I go inside and have a few drinks, and I come back, and I'm like, what the heck? Somebody's not respecting my property rights, man. My wallet is freaking gone. Okay, and I go and tell people this is like, what the heck? I left my wallet on my trunk and now it's stolen. I mean, you think anybody's gonna be sympathetic with me? They're gonna like say, well, actually, you're an idiot. Actually, they're not gonna feel sorry for me. Yes, somebody stole it from you, yeah, quote unquote, but you're a freaking idiot. Why are you leaving? So we understand that. I think even now we understand that what you own justly and effectively is that which you can defend, and that's pretty much it. I mean, John Locke, that doesn't matter.
I know you said that property rights in their essence are ahistorical, but historically we see regimes attempting to limit or to promote property rights and limit the offenses against such. Now, we recently had presidential candidates John McAfee and Austin Peterson on the show, and they both identify as minarchists. Now, how do you feel about minarchism, constitutional government, and the idea of the limited state in enforcing property rights?
Well, this is the problem, that ultimately all states live on violating property rights. They have to. You can't have a state that doesn't violate property rights. That's how they're marketed. They're like, let us violate your rights, in exchange for which we'll give you something awesome. We'll get you. we'll get you. I mean, it could be any kind of awesome thing, right? We're going to make sure you go to heaven. We'll give you a sense of national purpose. We'll make you great. We're going to trade you security. We're going to give you equality. Whatever. I mean, it just doesn't matter. There's a million excuses, but ultimately all states violate property rights, and I don't know how you get around that. It's just true. I don't think they contribute anything. I mean, minarchists is always saying that, look, without a state, we're all going to be pillaging each other. I think it's nonsense. I don't think a state does anything. I mean, it's just on a practical level. I mean, even now, when your rights are violated, you call the police. I mean, guess what? It ain't going to turn out so well, I mean, it's just, I think the state understands its role is to pillage you, not to protect yourself, to protect you from being pillaged. So I don't know. I think the minarchists invent in their heads a kind of mythical state that's never existed. It has nothing to do with practical. I mean, they're the most minarchists are the most impractical people. I mean, they just come up with this kind of crazy dream of a state that they like, but they have no power to make it do what they want it to do. And you look around the really existing states, as they've always existed, and they're not doing what they say that they should do. So I don't know. I think it's basically a figment of people's imaginations, essentially. And it's fine you want to dream things up or whatever, but it's kind of irresponsible, it seems to me, to go there. And look, I understand advocating maybe you think that advocating anarchy is too shocking, and it like ruins our reputations. People will never go along with our ideas, and that's a strategic point. And I'm, whatever. I don't care. I really don't care. I'm glad to just say I'm an anarchist, actually. But it's unscientific. It's ahistorical. There's no basis for believing that a minimal state has ever existed anywhere in history. They all live off violating property rights. States are just gangs that, for whatever reason, have bamboozled the population into going along with the rights violations. States do to us what we would never do to each other. essentially. I mean, they're specialized institutions in that way, and you have to sort of trick the population into going along with their agenda, or else you're never going to establish a state. You know?
Right. Individuals delegate rights to the state that they would never delegate to another individual.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So I mean, for me, it's hard. I mean, I'm unsympathetic to minarchism for this reason. I don't know where they come up with this idea. It doesn't seem to have any basis in theory or reality or anything else. So yeah, you could say on a pragmatic basis, look, I don't want to advocate anarchy because that makes me unmarketable. Okay, that's fine. It's up to you. You can say what you want. But I just think from a theory standpoint, no states are necessary at all. I don't think they should ever exist.
Now speaking of presidential candidates, now can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with Ron Paul and answer the age-old question if you really did ghostwrite his newsletters?
The age-old? I didn't know that was an age-old question. That's funny. No, I love Ron. He when I was working at National Journalism Center, my good friend Larry Reed recommended me to Ron as a person that could help him with his needs at the Foundation for Rational Economics and Education, I think, in Lake Jackson, Texas. So I was very pleased. So I moved there, and I worked for him for about a year. And he was just a wonderful man, a very sweet man, a genuine classical liberal, and a great guy. And I did work for the Ron Paul newsletters, helping to edit Ron's work and that sort of thing. I did not write the objectionable material that everybody's citing now. I mean, I was there at the time, and a very young man, alarmed, at some of the material that was appearing in the newsletter, but powerless really essentially to do anything about it because I just wasn't a principal player there. I was just happy to be working for Ron and very flattered to be there. And, mortifying to me, you can imagine, years later, seeing all this stuff dragged up and going, that doesn't represent Ron's views, it was just a very regrettable thing. I felt bad for him. I felt like he was kind of dealt a bad hand throughout there, as did everybody.
Now, can you answer the question if you think Ron really is a closet anarchist?
No, I don't think he is.
Okay.
Ron is, well, let me put it this way. Ron is a genuine liberal, if you know what I mean by that.
Classical.
Yeah, in a 19th century sense. That's where his heart is.
Right.
And he believes fundamentally that society needs liberty in order to form an orderly world. And I think he's kind of a bit like Hayek, like Mises, like many before him, is persuaded that in absence of law, that we would descend into a kind of we get something worse, maybe, if to make his case for him. But the thing I like about Ron the most is that he's not like a conservative who pretends to be a libertarian. I mean, he's a genuine classical liberal in the sense that, I mean, his formation came through Hans and Holtz and the Foundation for Economic Education. That's where his heart is, and that's what he's always believed in, and he's never really wavered in that. Now, it's true that during the 1980s, he wasn't always voting according to what today in 2016 we would consider to be libertarian positions. Like he supported some aspects of Reaganite foreign policy, voted for some wars and that sort of thing. His position back in the 80s was much closer to what you think of as Rand Paul's positions today, actually. But it's genuine liberalism, and I think his heart is really in the right place. But I don't think of him as being an anarchist. But I don't think he's prepared to deny that he is, because he doesn't want anyone to think of himself as a statist. We've got all these. I mean, Ron grew up in a world where anarcho-capitalism just didn't exist. And now he's surrounded by anarcho-capitalists always hectoring him about the question of the state, and he's like, whoa. Yeah, well, I mean, Hayek once confronted about the anarchy question. He said, "Look, I'm too old to be an anarchist. I'm embedded in my ways. Maybe if I were a younger man, I'd go here." I think more or less that's Ron's position.
Now, moving on to the next question here. I must say that I love the videos you've been recording for your followers on Facebook, explaining how every store you go to is a perfect example of the market at work, seeing as how these industries never existed until there was a consumer demand for it. Now, despite the fact that new industries are constantly popping up in response to changes in demand, a lot of people can't imagine the world without the existence of an entity that has a monopoly on force and coerces us to abide by its whims, aka government. Can you explain to our listeners how and why markets for defense, justice, and roads would pop up in the absence of the state, and how these would be much more efficient than the socialized services that we presently have?
Oh, I think it's a good point. I mean, the only thing that's stopping that right now is the monopolization of the state. And where the state lets go just a little bit, we immediately see private markets jumping into justice services and arbitration services and building private roads and private police. Sometimes I think, let me turn off this fan. It's a little bit noisy. Hold on. Sometimes I think anarchists are a little bit cavalier about this question about police power, because there really is such a thing as police and the private sector. I mean, security services. And my best example comes, I live in Atlanta. There's a private community here, and if you come to Atlanta, you have to go to it. There is a 2-square-mile region in the middle of Atlanta downtown that used to be a steel mill. And then when steel went to China, you know, they said, oh, we can fix it. We'll build public housing. And we know where that happened. What happened then? You know, it became infested with crime and that sort of thing. And finally, the city, out of money and ideas, just didn't know what to do. And a big developer came along and said, I tell you what, sell it to me. Just I'll buy the whole thing, as long as you let me build the streets, provide the police, you know, have my own rules that are independent of the city, and recruit businesses to come there. They're like, whatever. That saves us money. We don't know what the hell to do anyway. So the place is called Atlantic Station. It's 2 square miles in downtown Atlanta. And they have a completely private police force there. And these people are wonderful. It's hard for me to describe this to you, but you know, you drive up and there's a policeman there. You're like, good evening. He's like, you know, good evening. Great to see you. Thanks for visiting us at Atlantic Station. There's a sale on. There's a sale on over, you know, at this store. You're in time for a happy hour at that store. Are you going to catch a movie tonight? Like he's like a promoter of the business, right? Like, can you believe that? And so sweet and so nice. And you're just like, oh my God, a police person that I actually like. And they're there to help you all the time. And they do have to do some policing. Like, I've witnessed this in the past. There were some guys that were that had shown up, you know, the market's so great. But a few months ago, do you remember? Do you remember? This is before hoverboards. I mean, I don't know what happened to hoverboards. Like in the course of 3 months, they went from being like these dangerous pirate things to being like mainstream. But
and then back to being these dangerous pirate things.
This has been like September. So some guys had imported some exploding hoverboards, probably from China, and they drove up into Atlantic Station in their Camaro, and they were riding up and down the streets in these hoverboards, and we're all like, "Whoa, what's to do with this? What are you doing?" And they're like, "Hey, man, you gotta get one of these things. You know, these are great." Like, they're moving around. It's like, "Can I try them?" Yeah, okay, you fall. But they were selling them for cash for $1,000 each, and just doing a bang-up business right in the core of this private city. And, well, this is contrary to the rules of Atlantic Station. They don't allow people to just, you know, rove up and down the streets selling stuff. You know, that's just not the way their community works. So a policeman came up to him, and I was witnessing this because I thought these dudes were awesome selling pirate hoverboards from China, you know. And the policeman came up and said, "Listen, you guys gotta pack up your stuff and go. We can't allow this here." And they're like, "Yo, you know, dude, you know, leave us alone. We don't obey the man." And they were like rolling around, riding around him and everything. And these people are unarmed. So he gets out his radio and puts it in his ear and says, "Look, we've got a problem." There's a long pause, and the guys are kind of waiting. And then he gets off the phone and he goes, "Okay, I'm going to have to confiscate your hoverboards. I'm so sorry." And the guys are like, "You ain't going to confiscate nothing," you know. And so they rode off like lightning to their Camaro, threw all their hoverboards in the car, and took off. And the policeman was like, "Yes, victory." And I said to the guy afterwards, I said, "So is this the way policing happens here? You just sort of shoo people away?" He goes, "Oh, yeah, it always works." I said, "Well, I mean, they broke the rules. What would you have done if they hung around? He said, well, they never do. They always go, and everything's fine. I said, well, you don't have a gun? I said, well, who would you call? He said, oh, I didn't call really anybody. That was just a little ruse that I do. So they just threatened to confiscate their property, and the guys figured it was interesting. I mean, it was like a negotiation. It's like, okay, you've had your fun, but now I'm going to have to take your stuff. And the guys are like, you know, you're going to have to take your stuff. You want my stuff? You're going to have to catch me. And they ran off. It was like a negotiation in a way, you know? And the solution was peaceful, and it worked for everybody, and the criminals, so-called, got away with it, and they were feeling like, yo, we did it, you know, that was awesome, we made $5,000 a night. And the policeman was like, good, my community is protected from these vagrants. So everything sort of ended peacefully. And it was a beautiful thing to witness. I mean, just to watch it happen, because you realize, like, just so I'm clear, the policeman was not insisting on absolute compliance with all of his orders. You know, like when we get arrested by a policeman, he's like, okay, you're now my slave. You know, and you have to go along with everything he says, and we feel ourselves like metaphysically transformed, like, ugh. And you want to do something bad. You want to say, you know, screw you, buddy, and do something bad. But so you have to talk yourself into this kind of weird anti-human being that just like goes along with everything, you know. But in the private world, they don't. At Atlantic Station anyway, they don't insist on that from people. They don't insist on a robotic obedience. All they want is you to stop doing the bad thing. Do you see the difference? I mean, that's kind of like awesome, right? Anyway, that's a long answer to your question, but the point is that the markets will provide if the government gets out of the way. You know, I mean, and very creatively, I think. Justice, police, defense, everything. It's all there.
Don't forget the most important one, roads.
Roads, oh yeah, right? I mean, these roads are entirely private in Atlantic State. Jesus, the idea that, you know, private enterprise could invent this, you know, cell phone and bring oil from the bottom of the ocean, you know, to the gas station around the corner, but not know how to build a road is, you know, completely insane. I mean, obviously, you know, there's another point, gentlemen, that I would just want to raise about real world experience with private enterprise, which I think is fascinating. And it has to do with the immigration debate. Atlantic Station is a private community, right? But there's it's not gated. Like, you don't have to be a member to get in. You just drive in. And they're not suspicious of you. They're not like, hey, you know, you're on private property, buddy, you better shape up. They love you. They're glad for you to visit. They're advertising themselves. They want you to emigrate. You know, so it is like completely public access. You see what I mean? And they want immigration. They want everybody to live and breathe their community. And that's a little different from the way I think sometimes libertarians tend to think about what private property is. We think it's like a big sign that says, don't step on my grass, I'm going to kill you. Or you have to be a member of the community, like a country club or something like that. But in fact, I think the real world has shown us that private commercial districts, they want immigration, and they promote openness and integration and multiculturalism. That is the trajectory of markets, not towards racial homogeneity and exclusion, but really the opposite. It's towards integration, heterogeneity, everybody benefiting from each other, and inclusion. That's what markets, that's what the real world has shown us.
Now to follow up on your point about inclusion, can you tell us more about your conversion to Catholicism and your major influences in doing so?
Yeah, so I was raised in the Southern Baptist tradition, and I got a little bit bored with it because it struck me as, like, over time, I began to think of it as being a nationalist creed that was more based on creating homogeneous communities, you know? And there's something for that. I mean, I had something to say for that. I get that, all right? You want a church, and, you know, you want somebody to bring you meals when you're sick and blah, blah, blah. But it didn't seem very religiously significant in that way. So I began to investigate something more broad, and Catholicism attracted me because parish life in the Catholic Church, as any Catholic knows, is not really about the community. You know, you're going there for profound religious reasons, not for reasons of politics or reasons of language and nationhood. And it's a very mixed environment, right? So you're sitting next to, like the typical Catholic parish, people don't tend to own their own pews. I mean, you just sit next to anybody, and you can dress however you want, you know, and I loved the cultural inclusion. I mean, it struck me as like an element of truth to Catholicism, that it's so culturally and socially inclusive, that impressed me. And it took me a long time to convert, you know, like 3 years of kind of looking through all the doctrines and stuff. And finally, you know, I remember when I finally agreed to do it, I wasn't entirely convinced of the truth of the faith. But I thought, you know, there's something in me that just wanted me to be part of this whole world. And so I took the leap. And I haven't regretted it, really.
And can you tell us a little bit about the role of traditional Catholic music, aka Gregorian chant, in shaping your religious views?
Yeah, she was huge for me, actually. I mean, you know, religious conversions can be a little bit tedious for me, for people, so I don't want to go into too deeply. But the first time I heard an old priest singing the Latin chant from the altar, I was really struck that because I'm a musician, you know, I'd always been a musician, and I'd never heard music that was so like ridiculously simple and truth-telling, or it sounded anything like that, and I just became obsessed with it. Essentially, that was back in the days of where you didn't have iPhones, where I had to take my tape player in, so I'd sit on the front pew and just record his old voice, cracking and not beautiful, singing the mass, and it just impressed me so much. I just went home and started listening to it all the time, and then I went to go visit him afterwards because I wanted to know. And it was fast. It was a fascinating first visit, really, because I went up to the monastery, and this old priest comes out, and he puts his, I think he's what was he, Dominican, I guess, and he put his hood over his thing and said, "Let's go on a walk." And I began to pester him with religious questions, you know, like what about predestination, you know, what about infant baptism? How can you guys believe that water is holy, and what's with all these weird saints you're worshiping and everything? And I was just like bombarding them with questions, you know, and he just kind of said, well, why don't we talk about other things a little bit, you know? And he wanted to know where I was from, and we talked a little bit about the flowers in the garden and, you know, some struggles of life, and then we talked about music and the relationship between physics and music and natural law, and we got back to the monastery, and he said, well, my son, it's been a wonderful visit with you. I said, Father, what about all my doctrinal questions? I had some very highly intellectual issues I wanted to discuss with you. He said, oh, yeah. He said, you know what I think you need more than anything else? I think you need prayer. And he handed me a little monograph. It's called, it's where you trace the crucifixion of Jesus through a series of prayers. It's called the Stations of the Cross. He said, just pray this. So I went home, and I did. And suddenly I just began to realize that faith is not really about, you know, weird didactic doctrinal disputes. It's really about the human heart. And
your message in particular, Jeffrey, it resonates with me more than other libertarian theorists, since, like yourself, I am a fellow Catholic, and I'm sure that you've heard all the arguments before of people claiming that Jesus was a socialist. But I think a more careful examination of Christ's words and behaviors show that he did not advocate that we forcefully redistribute each other's goods, but rather ask that we voluntarily give up our belongings and voluntarily follow Christ, and that involuntarily accepting Christ, we will be redeemed from our sins. Can you explain why you believe Christianity fits perfectly with voluntarism or anarchism?
Yeah.
And can you also tell our listeners about Christ's relationship with the state?
Yeah, well, he had a difficult relationship. You know, they killed him. But Cardinal Ratzinger wrote a book long before he became a pope, where he said that Christ's weird confrontation that he had over the coin, you remember, where he said, give to God what belongs to God, and to the state what belongs to the state. That was a very significant moment in history, because unlike the ancient world, where people thought that God and the state were the same thing, that religion was about the state, that Christ was actually like erecting a kind of a conceptual distinction between these two, that they were different realms. The city of God and the city of man are really radically different. And once you begin to see that, then the state doesn't have a hold over your soul and your life anymore. Your loyalties change, and you realize that the state and God can be different and even conflicting. So that was like an awesome thing. And you see this all the time in his teaching. The core of Jesus' teaching ministry was his parables, right? I mean, the parable of great pride. I mean, I don't think people think of it this way, but that was true. I mean, he was a teacher who taught through stories. And so many of his awesome stories are about commercial situations, like the guy who builds the house on sand and then the wind comes and blows it down. And another guy blows it on a rock and it's very cool and it survives. Or the merchant who traded pearls at a low price and he sold them at a high price, and he found one for a really high price and he sold everything and got it, went into debt, and then oof, he won, the big prize. Or the case of the traveler who saw a treasure in a field. He's like, that's really cool. I wonder if the owner knows about it. Probably not. So he went and knocked on the front door of the guy's house and said, hey, buddy, how about if I just buy your place? It's kind of a shabby place, so I'll give you. The guy's like, oh, that's fine with me. So he sells it, and the guy's like, yes, win. Now I get both the house and the treasure. So or the owner of the vineyards, who's like, God, I got to harvest all this stuff. I need some workers. So he hires a bunch of people in the morning. They're working their asses off, and then the evening comes. He's like, I'm never going to get done here. So he goes out and hires some more people. But he's making this contract. He says, look, they're late in the day, and they're like, we're practically drunk here, sitting out here. I don't want to go to work for a stupid vineyard. He's like, look, let me pay you a lot of money. So he pays them a lot of money, and then they go back and they finish the harvest by the end of the day. And so the owner's going out and giving the wages, and he gives everybody the same wage. And the guys who had been working all day were like, hey, what the hell? I mean, I've been working my ass off all day, and you're paying these guys who just showed up an hour ago the same amount. I mean, the owner of the vineyard says, hey, it's my property. I do what I want. You agreed to the terms, so don't be bitter and don't be envious. Just take your money and go. And that's the end of the parable. And it goes on like this, like parable after parable after parable. It's all about markets and I don't know, even mention to you the case of the three sons, who get the talents, so-called, or really their investments. And he's like, do with this stuff what you want. And the first one, goes out and invests a lot of money. It's like awesome, and he reports back, and the guy says, hey, you're well done, my good and faithful servant. And the second one is a little bit more shabby, whatever. He starts like a startup, doesn't do so well. He's like, well, that's okay, And the third one says, well, I was so afraid to invest this money that I just buried it in the ground. And the master says, what is wrong with you? Why didn't you at least earn a natural rate of interest by depositing it with the bankers? And the guy's like, and the master goes, it condemns him to like, eternal death or whatever. It's like crazy, solely for not investing his money properly. Anyway, all of these stories, so many of them, require a kind of a commercial understanding, and I think it's kind of amazing that Jesus was able to tell these stories that even 2,000 years later we're like, oh, I get that. That makes sense to me. They don't seem like anachronistic at all. They seem like really pressing. And why did Jesus choose so many commercial themes? And I think it's because he understood that commerce and human engagement like this, and growing things and building things and investing things, is a persistent reality of human life, and that like thousands of years from now, it will still be a persistent aspect of human life, and people will still get it because they'll still be trading and investing and growing and building. I mean, this guy, he really had it together. I mean,
I think that's why we have principles, and that's why we follow them, because we can say with confidence that they apply consistently throughout human history, as Christ do.
Yeah, I mean, and if you look at Jesus' and any listeners haven't read Jesus' parables, you should go in and dig through them right now, because they are just great celebrations of commerce as a tool for learning and community building and personal ethics and everything else. Anyway, Jesus' teaching had nothing to do with the state. It's just ridiculous. The idea that he was advocating this or that, kind of government policy. He never did. I mean, and the proof of that is that he so often used these commercial scenes where free people are making decisions for themselves together with others and achieving a variety of results, you know?
I think that segues well into our last question before we wrap up here. So before I became a libertarian, I was very keen myself on using the state in order to protect the institution of marriage and promote moral behavior. What would you say to Christians that advocate using state coercion to protect Christianity? And if Christ is to be our gold standard, what would he make of this?
Yeah, the family. G.K. Chesterton used to say that the family precedes the state, and that's really true. It's just our desire to be with others and to propagate and to develop norms around our relationships so precede our political associations. I tend to see all of the state kind of stuff as like artificial, and the fact that the state like has intervened in this and dares to give like licenses and codify our marriages and adjudicate them. It's all outrageous, really. And I mean, and led to terrible distortions. Actually, I mean, the problems with the family today, and there are plenty, I think mostly trace to government intervention, really. The fact that governments presume to be the lord of marriage is the beginning of the end. So it's fascinating to me that you said that. That used to be your view. It does take a little bit of a kind of a intellectual shift to just let go. This is why I'm very much I favor same-sex unions in the sense that I favor any kind of human association, and anything that interferes with that I think is just a grave mistake. If you don't want to call it a marriage, that's fine. But actually, I think a liberal mind has to be tolerant, and find value in all forms of mutually beneficial human association. I see just absolutely nothing wrong with same-sex marriage on those grounds. Religious institutions are perfectly free to adjudicate their own marriage issues, and you both are Catholics, I assume, so you understand. I mean, the church has its own courts, I mean, canon law. You can talk about an anarchistic style institution. Catholic canon law exists not with swords and militaries,
but with voluntary interactions.
It's just a book of rules that everybody agrees to adhere to, and it's very effective, actually. So if you're a Catholic and you have a marital dispute, you're not going to be going to the judge. You're going to canon lawyers, essentially, and they adjudicate it for you. That's very anarchistic, and I think that's just awesome. And I assume the Jewish and Islamic traditions have the same thing. I mean, only chumps use the state.
And just for our listeners and followers, if anyone's looking for more information on the biblical sense of Jesus being an anarchist, the proof that we need, the different ways that the church actually has anarchist tendencies in its own way, I would highly recommend checking out my undergraduate thesis, which is available on YouTube.
Really? That's awesome.
Yes, and it's called Leaving the Cave, An Amiable Introduction to Anarchy, a Free Market Manifesto.
Oh, wow. That's neat. I didn't expect that this hangout would touch on the issues of religion. I'm usually cautious about talking about the subject. So just because
you're in good company here tonight.
Yeah, I mean, it's like politics and religion all smashed into one. Oh, heck, what are we going to do? So it's great that you asked me these questions, because actually, in fact, I do like talking about it, as you can tell. Yeah.
Most people do. They just try to suppress it because they're not that knowledgeable on the subject, or it makes them feel uncomfortable.
Yeah. The other thing that's awesome, I hate to just say one last thing about Catholicism, it is an internationalist religion, and that's very appealing to me. In that sense, it's consistent with old-fashioned liberalism. It doesn't recognize borders. And
right.
I just, what are part of the problems with the Protestant tradition? Even if you're Protestant, you have to recognize this. It's very much bound up with a language group and a national tradition, and borders and the sense of peoplehood that is really inconsistent with liberalism, I would say. So I think in that sense, Catholicism is a better kind of vehicle for that. I mean, it's funny to say something like this in front of a libertarian audience, because they're like, libertarians look at the Catholic Church and go, This thing is hierarchically organized. You're largely socialistic in its opinions. I mean, the present pope, is denouncing capitalism all the time, But, I think Catholics understand that our faith is not really about whatever the latest pope is saying. I mean, it doesn't particularly bog me. I kind of like the guy, all right? I mean, he's like, he's got issues, whatever, but our faith transcends states and it transcends time.
Now, I think that you struck a chord with me when you said when you just mentioned that Catholicism is without borders. Now, as we kind of aforementioned, at least in the United States, it seems that the majority of Christians are conservatives, and a lot of conservatives will promote borders and protectionism. Do you think that perhaps a way that we can win them over is by perhaps asking them, well, hey, if you think we need borders to constrain goods and services, would you be in favor of borders to constrain ideas? You have this great idea, this great gift of Christ that you want to sell. Are you using your logic consistently? Should we then constrain this to the United States? Do we not want to sell this good to the rest of the world? Do you think if we preach something like that, that can win them over to libertarianism?
Yeah, I think, yeah, maybe it could. I think that the Acton Institute does great work in selling old-fashioned.
Father Robert Sirico.
Yeah, an old friend. They do a very good job of taking in seminarians and tapping into that kind of universalist humanitarian impulse and saying the best way to achieve your aims is through freedom, right? Not through the state.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on tonight. You want to say something, James?
No, I just have to say, last second, I know you guys are both Catholic. I want to just make it known that I am no longer a practicing Catholic, but I do have a healthy respect for the Catholic Church, for Catholic doctrine. I do see a lot of good that can come out of it.
I love this line about I'm no longer because, a practicing Catholic because we all know the truth. Catholicism is something that gets deeply embedded into who you are, and the beauty of it really is that you can leave it. You can go very far away, and yet still very much at home anytime you want to be. So it's a beautiful luxury you experience, and I get that too. People have sometimes said to me, "You're a Catholic, but are you a bad Catholic?" And I'm like, yeah, and every Catholic is a very bad Catholic, actually. That's sort of who we are.
What drew me to Catholicism, growing up in a Catholic household, but what drew me to traditional Catholicism, Latin Mass, Trinitine Mass, was the people, was seeing the beauty, was seeing just how beautiful the people were and how they were able to interact with each other. Whatever intellectual, qualms I have with the church,
I get it.
But you're 100% correct when you say it's something that you can leave, you'll always be a part of, and you can always come back to. And we're all on our journey, and we're all, searching for the right answers.
That's exactly right.
Hey, Jeffrey, if you don't mind me chiming in here, I think the proof is in the pudding that James is going to crawl back, and let me tell you why. It's an interesting story how James and I met. Now, we both met at a conference up in New Hampshire last March. It was a Ted Cruz speaking event. Would you ever expect two anarcho-capitalists to meet at a Ted Cruz speaking event? I don't think this is merely a coincidence.
Yeah. No,
and then we meet and we start this great website that's really starting to take off.
It's a beautiful thing to, and you're a cradle Catholic, right? You were born that way and baptized as a
Yes, Italian American.
Yeah, and that's a great luxury. I feel very bad for people who have to convert to Catholicism in order to leave it because it's a big pain in the neck. I went through it at 23, and it's quite an upheaval to be a new Catholic. Saint John of the Cross, one of my favorite writers of the 16th century, talks about being new in the faith and how God holds you like a baby. And you feel close, ridiculously close, and you see things and feel things you hadn't ever seen or felt before, and this wild sense of security and combined with a little bit of a severe judgment towards the outside world. But as you mature, God lets you go, and and you're no longer at the breast. You're now you're a toddler. Now you're a teenager. Now you're a young professional, and that as time goes on, you experience what St. John of the Cross called the long dark night of the soul. A profound sense of absence of God, and this too is part of the plan of a life of faith. And I have to believe that no matter what your intellectual opinions are or where your temperament stands now with regard to faith, God is still there and still loving you, even if you don't feel it. And Mother Teresa herself said she went through this. So it's awesome, right? It's an awesome thing. I think it's good especially for libertarians, to go through this period of feeling a sense of the absence of God, because we need to become intellectually creative and independent. We need to find what it is that makes us tick and explore the nature of the universe and not feel bound by strict dogma and doctrines and stuff like that. I think.
And Jeffrey, just to make it clear, I'm in no way an atheist. I'm definitely still searching and reading and trying to find, my path.
I've always thought that atheism was just as dogmatic as the most extremist version of traditional Catholicism, actually.
I would agree 100%, if not more so.
Yeah. Better to just to feel yourself free and exploring things and be open to ideas. And this is the beauty about being a libertarian and an anarchist in particular, is that you are free to be courageous and look at new ideas and explore other traditions and apply the message of human liberty, to everything you do and everything you read. And it's an awesome thing. I think it's a path towards living a freer life. I mean, even if the state never changes, even if we never have any effect on the shape of the world, libertarianism and anarchism gives us as individuals a sense of freedom and enriches our lives. That's a good enough reason to be an anarchist, as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely. I want to thank you so much for coming on tonight, Jeffrey. I hope that this was a Thanksgiving dinner that we all wish we could have, where we got to discuss politics and religion tonight.
You guys are awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate you hounding me on this, and your questions were wonderful, and I've really enjoyed the hour with you.
Thank you. Us as well. It was a great pleasure. Now, in addition to liberty.me and fee.org, what else would you recommend that our listeners check out of yours?
I'm posting constantly on liberty.me, and fee.org is going very well. Laissez Faire Books, I'm still the editor there. Those are pretty much the things I would say. To get involved in a life of exploring the ideas of liberty, you're going to find a whole world out there, and it's a very beautiful world. From IHS to SFL to the Cato Institute, there's a lot going on, a lot of intellectual firmament. I believe that we're on the cutting edge of history, so listeners should explore it. Keep an open mind and incorporate these ideas into your life, and the world becomes more beautiful, I would say, as a libertarian.
Awesome. Thank you so much again, Jeffrey.
It's my pleasure. Thank you again.
Thank you guys so much for tuning into the Liberty Hangout podcast. Make sure you tune into the podcast again next Sunday at 6 p.m. Eastern, when we will be joined by Chase Rachels. Make sure you subscribe to the Liberty Hangout podcast on iTunes, subscribe to our YouTube channel, like us on Facebook, follow on Twitter at Liberty Hangout, and make sure to check out libertyhangout.org to read some awesome liberty-minded material from a great lineup of writers. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and we will see you again next time.